The warm rays of the sun cast a golden glow over the battlefield, illuminating the dusty terrain as the temperature rose to a scorching 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and smoke, a potent mix that hung heavy over the landscape like a bad omen. The scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hint of blooming wildflowers wafted through the air, a stark contrast to the chaos and destruction that was about to unfold. The humidity was oppressive 60%, making every breath feel like a chore, and the soldiers on both sides could be seen wiping the sweat from their brows as they prepared for battle. In the distance, the sound of artillery fire echoed through the valleys, a low rumble that shook the ground beneath their feet. The M109A6 Paladin self-propelled howitzers, with their 155mm cannons, were positioned behind a ridge, their crews busily loading the next round, as they prepared to unleash a barrage of high-explosive shells upon the enemy. The cannons' barrels were still warm from the previous salvos, and the smell of hot metal and cordite hung in the air, a pungent reminder of the devastation they were capable of unleashing. To the left, a company of infantrymen, armed with the M4A1 carbine, a 5.56mm, gas-operated, magazine-fed select-fire assault rifle, crouched behind a wall of sandbags, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of enemy movement. The M4A1s were equipped with the M150 rifle combat optic, a 4x magnification scope, with a illuminated reticle, and the soldiers had also attached M320 grenade launchers to their rifles, giving them a versatile and formidable firepower capability. The soldiers' helmets, adorned with the insignia of their unit, the 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, were securely fastened, and their Kevlar vests were tightly strapped, providing them with a sense of security as they peered out into the unknown. As the soldiers waited, they could hear the sound of enemy aircraft, a Russian-made Mi-24 Hind helicopter, its 5-bladed rotor whirring as it flew low and fast over the battlefield, its 30mm cannon and 80mm rocket pods at the ready. The Hind was a formidable opponent, its armor-plated fuselage and tail boom making it nearly invulnerable to small arms fire. And the soldiers knew they would have to be lucky to take it down. The helicopter's pilots, trained in the art of combat flying, were experts at using the terrain to their advantage, and they flew the Hind with a precision that was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. To the right, a platoon of armor, equipped with the M1A2 Abrams main battle tank, their 120mm smoothbore cannons and .50 caliber machine guns at the ready, rumbled forward, their tracks churning up the earth as they moved into position. The M1A2s were equipped with the advanced composite armor, a state-of-the-art armor package that provided all-around protection against anti-tank missiles and other threats. The tank's engines, a 500 horsepower AGT-1500 gas turbine, roared as they moved, and the smell of diesel fuel and hot metal filled the air, a potent reminder of the raw power that these machines represented. As the tanks moved forward, they were accompanied by a squad of infantrymen, armed with the Javelin anti-tank missile system, a fire-and-forget missile that could penetrate even the thickest armor. The Javelin's launch tube, a CLU, or Command Launch Unit, was slung over the soldier's shoulder, and the missile itself was a marvel of modern technology, with its infrared seeker and tandem warhead. The soldiers moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of enemy armor, as they provided security for the tanks as they moved into position. The battlefield was a complex tapestry of sound and smell, a kaleidoscope of sensory input that threatened to overwhelm the senses. The soldiers, trained to operate in this environment, moved with a precision and purpose, their movements choreographed to the sound of gunfire and the rumble of engines. The air was thick with tension, the sense of anticipation hanging over the battlefield like a physical presence, as the soldiers on both sides waited for the battle to begin. As the minutes ticked by, the tension continued to build, the sense of anticipation growing thicker and more palpable. The soldiers on both sides knew that the battle was about to begin, and they steeled themselves for the chaos and destruction that was to come. The sound of gunfire and explosions would soon fill the air, and the smell of smoke and sweat would hang heavy over the landscape. The battle was about to begin, and only time would tell who would emerge victorious. The M109A6 Paladins, still positioned behind the ridge, were now loaded and ready to fire, their cannons elevated to the correct angle, and their crews waiting for the order to unleash a barrage of high-explosive shells upon the enemy. The infantrymen, still crouched behind the wall of sandbags, had their rifles at the ready, their fingers resting lightly on the triggers as they scanned the horizon for any sign of enemy movement. The tanks, now in position, had their cannons and machine guns trained on the enemy, and the javelin teams were poised and ready to launch their missiles at a moment's notice. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the battle was about to begin. The sense of anticipation hung in the air like a challenge, and the soldiers on both sides steeled themselves for the fight of their lives. The next few minutes would be crucial, as the two armies clashed in a frenzy of gunfire and explosions. The outcome was far from certain, and only time would tell who would emerge victorious from the chaos and destruction that was about to unfold. The battle was about to begin, and the world held its breath, as the soldiers on both sides prepared to face the ultimate test of courage and strength. As the battle commenced, the Allied forces, comprised of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, employed a multifaceted approach to outmaneuver their adversaries. The infantry, divided into distinct battalions, advanced in a series of coordinated movements, each designed to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. The left flank, consisting of seasoned veterans, marched in a diagonal formation, angling their approach to capitalize on the high ground to their advantage. This tactical positioning allowed them to pour enfilading fire onto the enemy's exposed right flank, weakening their resolve and creating an opportunity for the Allied cavalry to strike. Meanwhile, the center battalion, bolstered by the presence of heavy artillery, pushed forward in a direct, linear formation. The artillery, precision-guided by forward observers, delivered targeted salvos that effectively breached the enemy's central strongpoints. As the artillery fire lifted, the infantry surged forward, their rifles at the ready, to consolidate the gains made by the preceding bombardment. This synchronized effort between the artillery and infantry branches exemplified the Allies' mastery of combined arms warfare, underscoring their ability to harmonize different combat disciplines to achieve a synergistic effect on the battlefield. The right flank, tasked with securing the Allies' vulnerable extremity, adopted a more cautious stance. Here, light infantry units, distinguished by their agility and rapid redeployment capabilities, were deployed to outfly NK and harass the enemy's left wing. These skirmishers, often operating in detached, autonomous formations, utilized the terrain to their advantage, darting between natural cover to launch surprise attacks on the enemy's unguarded positions. By maintaining constant pressure on the enemy's flanks, the Allies successfully pinned down their opponents, restricting their freedom of maneuver and preventing them from effectively responding to the threats emerging elsewhere on the battlefield. As the engagement intensified, the Allied cavalry, held in reserve until this point, began to exert its influence. Composed of heavily armored units and lighter, more agile squadrons, the cavalry was poised to deliver the decisive blow. Its commander, a seasoned veteran with an acute understanding of the evolving battlefield dynamics, waited for the optimal moment to commit his forces. This arrived when the enemy's center, already weakened by the relentless artillery bombardment and the unyielding pressure from the Allied infantry, began to show signs of fragmentation. Seizing the initiative, the cavalry commander launched his heavy squadrons in a thunderous charge, aiming directly at the heart of the enemy's disintegrating formation. The impact was immediate and devastating. The enemy lines, already strained to the breaking point, were unable to withstand the fury of the cavalry assault. As the horsemen crashed into the enemy's midst, their lances and swords rising and falling in deadly arcs, the enemy's cohesion began to disintegrate. Units that had, until this moment, held firm, began to waver, their soldiers either fleeing in panic or surrendering en masse. The Allied infantry, sensing victory within their grasp, pressed their advantage, driving forward with renewed vigor to capitalize on the chaos sown by the cavalry. In the aftermath of this pivotal engagement, the battlefield presented a scene of utter devastation. The enemy's formations lay shattered, their soldiers either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The Allies, though they too had suffered losses, stood triumphant, their tactics and training having borne fruit in the face of a determined adversary. The battle served as a stark reminder of the importance of adaptability, coordination, and the judicious employment of combined arms on the modern battlefield. As military historians reflect on this engagement, they are drawn to the intricate ballet of movements, the calculated risks, and the unwavering commitment to gaining a decisive victory that characterized the Allies' campaign. The evolution of tactics during this period was marked by an increasing recognition of the interdependence of different combat branches. Commanders began to appreciate the value of harmonizing the actions of infantry, artillery, and cavalry to achieve a unified purpose. This integration was not merely a product of theoretical musings, but was forged in the crucible of combat, where the stakes were highest and the consequent CES of failure most dire. The resulting synthesis of doctrine and practice gave rise to a new generation of military leaders, men who were adept at orchestrating complex operations and who understood that the key to success lay not in the brute application of force, but in the subtle manipulation of the battlefield's myriad factors to their advantage. In this context, the deployment of artillery, with its capacity to deliver precision firepower at long range, played a transformative role. Artillery's ability to weaken enemy strongpoints, disrupt supply lines, and demoralize troops through relentless bombardment made it an indispensable component of any military strategy. The development of more sophisticated artillery systems, capable of firing a variety of ammunition types and engaging targets with enhanced accuracy, further amplified its importance. Commanders learned to integrate artillery fire with the maneuvers of infantry and cavalry, using it to soften enemy defenses, facilitate advances, and cover withdrawals. The infantry, the backbone of any army, also underwent significant transformations in response to the changing nature of warfare. Infantry tactics evolved to emphasize maneuverability, with units being trained to operate in more flexible, dispersed formations. This allowed them to present a less compact target to enemy firepower, while also enabling them to exploit gaps in the enemy's defenses more effectively. The introduction of new technologies, such as the rifle and machine gun, which offered increased lethality at longer ranges, compelled infantry commanders to revisit traditional doctrines and embrace more fluid, adaptive strategies. Cavalry, often viewed as the most glamorous branch of the military, saw its role morph in response to advancements in weaponry and the changing face of battle. No longer could cavalry rely solely on the shock value of a massed charge to break enemy lines. Instead, cavalry units were increasingly used as mounted infantry, leveraging their mobility to rapidly redeploy, outflank, and pursue a disorganized enemy. Their traditional function as a battlefield reserve, to be unleashed at the decisive moment to deliver a crushing blow, remained intact, but this was now complemented by a more nuanced understanding of their capabilities and limitations in a modern combat environment. The interplay between these branches, and the need for coordinated action to achieve strategic objectives, became a central theme in military planning. Commanders recognized that victory would not be won by a single, heroic charge or a solitary act of bravery, but through the systematic application of force, carefully managed and precisely directed. This shift towards a more holistic approach to warfare reflected a broader cultural and technological transformation, one that was redefining the character of conflict and pushing military leaders to innovate and adapt in order to remain relevant. As historians delve deeper into the intricacies of this conflict, they are struck by the complexity and the sheer scale of the operations involved. The battles were not simply chaotic melees, but rather intricate dances of death, choreographed by commanders who sought to impose their will upon the enemy through a combination of force, maneuver, and deception. Each element of the army played its part, from the thunder of the artillery and the dash of the cavalry to the steadfast resolve of the infantry, who bore the brunt of the fighting and upon whose shoulders the outcome of the battle ultimately rested. In this grand tapestry of war, each thread, no matter how small, contributed to the overall pattern, and the removal of any single strand could potentially unravel the entire fabric of the campaign. As the sun began to set on the battlefield, the chaos only intensified. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and blood, and the sounds of gunfire, screams, and explosions filled the air. The troops on both sides were exhausted, but they knew they had to keep fighting if they were to emerge victorious. On the eastern flank, the Allied forces were making a push against the enemy's defenses. The M1 Abrams tanks, with their 120mm smoothbore cannons, were leading the charge, ripping through the enemy's lines with ease. The tanks, advanced armor packages, which included reactive armor and composite armor, allowed them to withstand even the most intense barrage of enemy fire. The tanks' engines roared as they moved forward, their tracks clanking against the ground, sending shockwaves through the earth. Behind the tanks, the infantry was moving forward, taking cover behind whatever they could find. They were armed with the latest M4A1 carbines, which featured a 14.5-inch barrel and a 6-position telescoping stock. The rifles were equipped with advanced optics, including night vision scopes and laser designators, allowing the soldiers to engage enemy targets with pinpoint accuracy. The infantry was also supported by M249 SAW machine guns, which were capable of laying down a withering field of fire, pinning down enemy troops and allowing the Allies to gain ground. As the Allies moved forward, they were met with fierce resistance. The enemy was armed with advanced Russian-made weaponry, including the T-90 tank, which was equipped with a 125mm smoothbore cannon and advanced reactive armor. The T-90 was a formidable opponent, capable of taking out even the most heavily armored Allied tanks. The enemy infantry was also well armed, with AK-74M assault rifles and PKM machine guns, which were capable of putting out a high volume of fire. The battlefield was a scene of utter chaos, with troops on both sides fighting for their lives. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and the smell of smoke and sweat hung heavy in the air. The ground was littered with the bodies of the dead and wounded, and the cries of the injured filled the air. Despite the chaos, the Allied troops remained pushing forward with a fierce determination. To the north, the Allied air support was providing close air cover, with F-16 fighter jets screaming through the skies, their afterburners roaring as they delivered precision-guided munitions against enemy targets. The F-16s were equipped with advanced radar systems, including the AN/APG-66 radar, which allowed them to detect and engage enemy aircraft at long range. They were also armed with AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, which were capable of taking out enemy air defenses. The enemy air defenses were putting up a fierce fight, with S-300 surface-to-air missiles rising from the ground to engage the Allied aircraft. The S-300 was a highly advanced system, capable of engaging targets at ranges of up to 150 kilometers. However, the Allied aircraft were equipped with advanced countermeasures, including chaff and flares, which allowed them to evade the enemy missiles. As the battle raged on, the logistics of the war effort were becoming increasingly complex. The Allies were relying on a complex network of supply chains to keep their troops equipped and fed. The supply chains stretched back thousands of miles, from the front lines to the factories and warehouses in the rear. The logistics teams were working around the clock to ensure that the troops had everything they needed to fight, from ammunition and fuel to food and medical supplies. The medical supplies were particularly critical, as the number of wounded continued to mount. The medical teams were working tirelessly to treat the injured, often in makeshift hospitals and aid stations near the front lines. The medical supplies included everything from basic first aid kits to advanced surgical equipment, and the medical teams were trained to deal with even the most severe injuries. Despite the challenges, the Allies were making progress, slowly but surely pushing the enemy back. The enemy was beginning to tire, their supplies dwindling as the Allies cut off their lines of communication and supply. The enemy commanders were becoming increasingly desperate, ordering their troops to fight to the last man. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the battlefield was bathed in a golden glow. The sounds of gunfire and explosions continued to echo through the air, but there was a sense of unease, a feeling that the battle was far from over. The Allies knew that they still had a long and difficult road ahead of them, but they were determined to see it through to the end. They were fighting for their country, for their freedom, and for their very way of life. In the distance, the silhouette of a city rose up, its buildings and towers reaching towards the sky like giants. The city was the key to the entire region, a strategic location that controlled the flow of trade and commerce. The Allies knew that they had to take the city if they were to win the war, and they were preparing for a final, decisive push. The troops were gathered behind TH lines, waiting for the order to advance. They were tired, hungry, and thirsty, but they were ready to do whatever it took to win. They knew that the battle would be fierce, that they would be facing some of the toughest fighting of their lives, but they also knew that they had the training, the equipment, and the determination to emerge victorious. As the night wore on, the tension continued to build. The troops were on high alert, waiting for the signal to move forward. The officers were checking and rechecking their plans, making sure that everything was in place for the final push. The logistics teams were working overtime, making sure that the troops had everything they needed to fight. In the midst of the chaos, a sense of calm was beginning to descend. The troops were focusing on the task at hand, putting aside their fears and doubts. They were becoming a well-oiled machine, working together like a finely tuned orchestra. They knew that they were about to embark on a journey that would change their lives forever, a journey that would take them to the very limits of human endurance. As the clock struck midnight, the battlefield was bathed in an eerie silence. The troops were waiting, watching, and waiting. They knew that the next few hours would be the most critical of the entire war, that the fate of the region hung in the balance. They were ready to do whatever it took to win, to fight to the last man if necessary. The stage was set for a final, decisive battle, that would determine the course of history. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a bloody orange glow over the ravaged landscape, the battle reached its crescendo. The air was thick, with the acrid smell of smoke and sweat, the stench of death hanging heavy over the trenches like a malignant specter. The earth shuddered beneath the feet of the soldiers as the artillery bombardment intensified, a relentless drumbeat of destruction that threatened to consume everything in its path. The cries of the wounded and the dying filled the air, a haunting chorus of pain and despair that seemed to come from all directions at once. The sound of gunfire and explosions was a constant, a deafening roar that made it impossible to think, to reason, to escape the maelstrom of chaos that had engulfed the battlefield. The ground was scorched and blackened, pockmarked with craters, and strewn with the twisted, broken bodies of the fallen. In the midst of this bedlam, a young lieutenant, his face smeared with dirt and blood, crouched behind a crumbling wall, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. His rifle, once a gleaming instrument of war, was now smeared with mud and oil, its barrel still hot from the countless rounds he had fired into the fray. His heart pounded in his chest, a runaway drumbeat that threatened to burst free from his ribcage at any moment. To his left, a machine gunner, his face set in a grim mask of determination, poured round after round into the enemy lines, the gun's muzzle flashing like a firefly in the fading light. The sound of the gun was a steady, pulsing rhythm, a hypnotic beat that seemed to draw the enemy in, like moths to a flame. The gunner's eyes were fixed on some point in the distance, his gaze unyielding, unrelenting, as he worked the gun with a practiced ease that belied the chaos around him. Suddenly, a shell screamed in, its trajectory flat and true, striking the ground mere yards away with a deafening crash. The lieutenant felt the blast wave wash over him, a scorching wall of heat that seemed to sear the air from his lungs. He stumbled back, his vision blurring, his ears ringing from the concussion. When his sight cleared, he saw that the machine gunner was gone, vanished in an instant, leaving behind only a tangled, smoking wreck of twisted metal and flesh. The lieutenant's mind reeled, his thoughts spinning in a mad whirl of fear and confusion. He stumbled forward, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. The battlefield was a kaleidoscope of color and sound, a mad, swirling vortex of chaos and destruction. Everywhere he looked, he saw the fallen, the wounded, the dying. The cries of the wounded were a constant, a haunting reminder of the horrors that surrounded him. As he stumbled through the wreckage, the lieutenant saw a figure, a soldier, stumbling towards him, his face blackened with smoke, his eyes wild with fear. The soldier's uniform was torn and tattered, his helmet gone, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, their gazes meeting in a flash of understanding, of shared terror. Then, in an instant, the soldier was gone, cut down by a burst of gunfire that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The lieutenant felt a cold, creeping sense of dread as he realized that he was alone, that he was the only one left standing in a sea of death and destruction. The battlefield was a desolate, barren landscape, a wasteland of smoke and ash, of twisted metal and broken flesh. The cries of the wounded were a distant, fading echo, a reminder of all that had been lost, all that had been destroyed. And yet, even in the midst of this unutterable chaos, there was a sense of calm, a sense of detachment, a sense of observing the battle from afar, as if the lieutenant's mind had somehow separated itself from his body, allowing him to watch the carnage unfold with a dispassionate, almost clinical eye. It was as if he had transcended the battle, risen above the fray, to observe the destruction with a sense of wonder, of awe, of horror. The artillery bombardment continued, a relentless, pounding rhythm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The lieutenant felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, felt the air vibrate with the force of the explosions. The sound was a living thing, a creature that breathed and pulsed and seemed to have a life of its own. It was a sound that filled the senses, a sound that overwhelmed the mind, a sound that reduced all thought, all reason, to a mere, gibbering chaos. As the darkness deepened, the lieutenant felt himself becoming one with the battle, becoming a part of the landscape, a part of the chaos. He was no longer a soldier, no longer a man, but a mere, insignificant speck, A tiny, forgotten fragment of a greater, more terrible whole. The battle was a force of nature, a hurricane of steel and fire that swept all before it, leaving nothing but destruction, nothing but death, in its wake. And in the midst of this maelstrom the lieutenant found a strange, perverse sense of peace, a sense of belonging, of being a part of something greater than himself. It was a sense of oneness, with the battle, with the chaos, with the destruction. He was no longer alone, no longer afraid, for he had become one with the madness, one with the mayhem. He was a part of the battle, a part of the war, a part of the unutterable, unspeakable horror that had engulfed them all. The darkness closed in, a suffocating shroud of smoke and ash, of death and destruction. The lieutenant's vision began to blur, his thoughts to fragment, his mind to unravel. He stumbled forward, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. But there was nothing. Only the darkness, only the chaos, only the unutterable, unspeakable horror of the battle. And in that moment the lieutenant knew that he was doomed, that he was lost, that he was forever trapped in the abyss of war, in the madness of the battlefield. The once pristine landscape was now a gruesome testament to the brutality of war. The air reeked of smoke, sweat, and blood as the survivors stumbled through the carnage, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of hope. The immediate aftermath of the battle was a bleak and desolate scene, with the wounded crying out in agony and the dead lying still, their bodies torn apart by the relentless onslaught of artillery and small arms fire. Casualty reports began to filter in, each one a grim reminder of the devastating cost of the conflict. The numbers were staggering, with thousands of soldiers on both sides killed or wounded in the fighting. The medical teams worked tirelessly to tend to the injured, but their efforts were often in vain, as the sheer scale of the casualties overwhelmed their resources. Surgeons worked around the clock, amputating limbs and patching up wounds, but even their best efforts could not stem the tide of death that seemed to sweep across the battlefield like a dark and malevolent force. Individual stories of survival began to emerge, each one a testament to the indomitable human spirit that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of unimaginable horror. There was the story of Private Johnson, who had been buried alive in a trench when a shell exploded nearby, only to dig his way out and stumble back to his unit. Covered in dirt and blood but still clinging to his rifle. Then there was the tale of Sergeant Thompson, who had single-handedly held off an enemy platoon, firing his machine gun until it jammed, and then using his pistol to pick off the remaining attackers one by one. As the survivors stumbled through the wreckage, they encountered scenes that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. A group of soldiers came across a crater filled with the bodies of their comrades, their faces frozen in perpetual screams of terror. Another patrol stumbled upon a makeshift aid station, where the wounded lay piled on top of each other, their moans and cries filling the air as they begged for morphine or water. The stench of death and decay hung over the battlefield like a shroud, a constant reminder of the terrible price that had been paid in blood and sacrifice. Despite the overwhelming devastation, there were moments of humanity that pierced the darkness. A medic was seen cradling a dying soldier in his arms, tears streaming down his face as he whispered words of comfort in the young man's ear. A group of soldiers shared what little food and water they had, bonding over their shared experience of survival. Even in the midst of such unmitigated disaster, there were glimpses of compassion and kindness that reminded the survivors that they were still human beings, not just automatons driven by a desire to kill. As the days passed, the survivors began to take stock of their situation. They were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, but they were not yet defeated. They knew that they had to keep moving, to find a way to escape the killing zone and regroup with what was left of their unit. It was a daunting task, but they steeled themselves for the journey ahead, drawing on every last ounce of strength and courage they possessed. They moved through the ruins of the battlefield, avoiding the enemy patrols that still prowled the area, searching for stragglers to capture or kill. The sun beat down on them, relentless in its ferocity, as they trudged through the mud and the blood-soaked earth. They were a bedraggled and battered bunch, their uniforms torn and tattered, their faces gaunt and exhausted. But they refused to give up, driven by a fierce determination to survive and to emerge victorious from the carnage. They knew that the road ahead would be long and hard, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay in store, armed with nothing but their rifles, their courage, and their unyielding commitment to one another. As they walked, they stumbled upon the remnants of a village, its buildings reduced to rubble and ashes. The streets were empty and silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. They moved cautiously, scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger, their senses heightened as they navigated the desolate landscape. It was a scene of utter desolation, a testament to the destructive power of war and the devastating impact it had on innocent civilians. The survivors exchanged glances, their faces etched with a mix of emotions, sadness, anger, and frustrations. They knew that they were not just fighting for their own lives, but for the lives of those who had been caught in the crossfire. The innocent men, women, and children who had been torn from their homes and their families by the conflict. They thought of their own loved ones, their wives and children, their parents and siblings, and the thought of what they might be going through back home filled them with a renewed sense of purpose. As they continued on their journey, they encountered more and more survivors, each with their own story of hardship and struggle. There was the young lieutenant who had lost his entire platoon in a single day, and was now left to grapple with the guilt and the grief of being the sole survivor. There was the medic, who had spent hours tending to the wounded, only to see them die one by one, their bodies piling up around him like so much discarded rubbish. And there was the private, who had been separated from his unit, and was now wandering the battlefield alone, searching for any sign of his comrades. Each of these stories was a testament to the human cost of war, a reminder that the conflict was not just about armies and generals, but about ordinary people who had been caught up in the maelstrom. They were stories of courage and sacrifice, of fear and survival, of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. And as the survivors shared their tales, they found comfort in the knowledge that they were not alone, that they were part of a larger community that had been forged in the fire of war. The journey was long and arduous, but the survivors pressed on, driven by a fierce determination to survive. They knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay in store. They were a band of brothers, bound together by their shared experience of combat, and they would stop at nothing to emerge victorious from the carnage. As they walked, they sang softly to themselves, their voices barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. It was a haunting melody, a lament for the dead and the dying, and a testament to the unbreakable bond that existed between the survivors. As we conclude our examination of the historical events that have shaped the world, it is evident that the long-term geopolitical impact has been profound. The intricate web of alliances, rivalries, and conflicts has led to a complex landscape that continues to evolve to this day. The consequences of these events have been far-reaching, with effects on global politics, economies, and societies that are still being felt. One of the most significant legacies of these events is the modern system of international relations. The emergence of new global powers, the rise of nationalism, and the decline of colonial empires have all contributed to a shift in the balance of power. This, in turn, has led to the development of new institutions, agreements, and norms that govern international relations. The United Nations, the European Union, and the Bretton Woods system are just a few examples of the many organizations and frameworks that have been established to promote cooperation, stability, and peace. However, despite these efforts, the world remains a volatile and unpredictable place. The legacy of historical conflicts continues to simmer, with many disputes and tensions remaining unresolved. The Middle East, for example, remains a hotspot of conflict, with the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, the Syrian civil war, and the Iranian nuclear program all contributing to regional instability. Similarly, the Korean peninsula remains a source of tension, with the ongoing standoff between North and South Korea and the threat of nuclear proliferation. In addition to these regional conflicts, the world is also facing a range of global challenges. Climate change, terrorism, pandemics, and economic inequality are just a few of the many issues that require international cooperation and collective action. The legacy of historical events has created a complex and interconnected world, where the actions of one nation or group can have far-reaching consequences for others. As we reflect on the long-term geopolitical impact of historical events, it is clear that the world is at a crossroads. The choices we make today will have a profound impact on the future, and it is essential that we learn from the past to build a better tomorrow. This requires a deep understanding of the complexities of international relations, the nuances of global politics, and the interconnectedness of the world. In conclusion, the study of history is not merely an academic exercise, but a vital tool for navigating the complexities of the modern world. By examining the long-term geopolitical impact of historical events, we can gain a deeper understanding of the forces that shape our world and the challenges that lie ahead. As the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." This statement underscores the dynamic and ever-changing nature of the world, and the need for continuous learning, adaptation, and evolution. As we move forward in an increasingly complex and interconnected world, it is essential that we remain vigilant, informed, and engaged. The study of history is a lifelong journey, and one that requires dedication, curiosity, and a passion for learning. I hope that this series has inspired you to explore the rich and fascinating world of military history, and to continue learning about the events that have shaped our world. If you have enjoyed this series, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, where we will continue to explore the complex and fascinating world of military history. From the ancient battles of the past to the modern conflicts of the present, we will examine the tactics, strategies, and technologies that have shaped the course of human conflict. Join us on this journey of discovery, and together, let us uncover the secrets of the past to build a better future. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to sharing more stories of military history with you in the future. Please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos.